Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 148. Today's guest is Sarah Rose Etter. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today's conversation is with writer Sarah Rose Etter. Sarah Rose Etter is the author of the chapbook Tongue Party and the book of X, winner of a Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel. Her work has appeared in Time, Guernica, Bomb, The Bennington Review, The Cut, Vice, and elsewhere. She has been awarded residencies at the Jack Kerouac House, the Disquiet International Program in Portugal, and the Gulkistan in Iceland. She earned her BA in English from Pennsylvania State University and her MFA in fiction from Rosemont College. She lives in Los Angeles. For more info, visit sarahroseetter.com. Now, I have been a fan of Sarah's work since The Book of X came out in 2019. That book is a surrealist story about a young woman who is born with her body in the shape of a knot. Literally, her torso is twisted in the shape of an overhand knot. The book is strange and grotesque, with characters quarrying meat out of the ground with their bare hands. And it is also very much about the body, about grief, about alienation, and about the ways that the world grinds women down. A lot of these same themes appear in Sarah's latest book, Ripe, in which the protagonist is a young woman who lives in a late capitalist hellscape of San Francisco, who works for this soul-sucking Silicon Valley tech company while surrounded by co-workers who are true believers with a capital B, and who is followed around by her own personal black hole. The story is sharp and bleak and tense and darkly comic at times. And in that way, it is, I think, kind of a perfect encapsulation of the current moment, not just in the Bay Area, but in America at large, maybe the world. I understand that one of her readers described it to her as a, quote, heart attack, but in a good way. And yeah, that does seem pretty apt to me. I was really happy to get to talk to Sarah about it. Before we get started, just a couple things to mention. As always, there are links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Ripe. There are links to Skylight Books in LA, the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and to bookshop.org. But of course, if there is an independent bookstore in your area, that's where I'd recommend you put in an order. I've also put in a link to Sarah's website where, among other things, you can find links to a bunch of her short fiction that's out there elsewhere on the internet, a lot of which is available for free and all of which is worth your time. Finally, if you've been enjoying the show, I wanted to invite you to join our Patreon at patreon.com/likewisemedia. Keep the Channel Open is a truly independent one-person podcast, and 100% of the financial support comes from you, the listeners. For just $2 per month, you can not only help keep the show running, but you also get access to the show's bonus audio archive, which includes readings from past guests like Rachel Zucker, Liz Lenz, Matthew Salis's, and many more. There's also bonus interviews with the authors of the short stories from my other podcast, Likewise Fiction, as well as short audio essays from me about different art and literature topics. This month's bonus essay is about short stories and the emotional friction of endings and beginnings. If any of that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you want to help support the show, go to patreon.com/likewisemedia and sign up to make a monthly donation. There's a link in the show notes for that. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Sarah Rose Etter. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I was a big fan of your first book of, I guess it wasn't your first book, but your first novel, The Book of X, which I was introduced to by Julia Dixon Evans when she was on the show a long time ago. And then, of course, she set up that little reading that we both got to be at, which was very fun.
Yeah, I love that reading. That was a really special time.
Yeah, you and me and Tommy Pico and Lillian Rivera. It was a good time.
Yeah, and wasn't Kristen Arnett there too?
Oh shit, that's right. You're right.
Yeah. You know, we were just talking about this because I just went to her wedding and we were talking about how that was one of the first weekends that we all like met Kayla and like knew that they were going to be serious about each other. Because once you take someone on book tour with you, you have to be pretty in deep, you know, because book tour is not pretty. So you tend to not, take someone with you on that unless you're going to be pretty serious with them most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't believe I forgot that Kristen was.
No, there were a lot of people there. It was a hectic one. The reason it's marked in my mind is I'm pretty sure that was like when White Claw came out that day, and we had Tommy try a White Claw for the first time. And I don't know why that's like stuck in my brain. It's like the day the White Claw came out. But yeah, it was a fun night.
Yeah, it was fun. But yeah, I mean, I remember reading I think I bought the Book of X at that reading, and I really liked it. And then, so when Ripe came out, I was really looking forward to it. And it's really interesting to sort of compare the two books to see how they're similar and different.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of very similar themes that sometimes I don't notice until it's already out. I think there's a way where they're just dealing with a lot of the same things for sure. But I did feel this time going into it that I wanted it to be a little bit less surreal, because when I look at the Book of X, I kind of feel myself hiding. Like the surrealism was kind of a way for me to keep the truth or like the authenticity at arm's length, right? Because if it's surreal, then I don't have to own it, or I don't have to be responsible for it in some way. And I mean that like even hiding it from myself, not just, the reader. But there's also a way that it keeps the reader at arm's length, right? Because if you're going to go that surreal and that weird, it is sort of putting up a barrier, because there's only a certain kind of reader who's going to be willing to get over that and come with you. And so I did think this time I did want to be like a little more authentic, and that to me meant like stripping some of that back and maybe not being as weird. But that was also largely because it was so solidly had to be set in San Francisco, right? So that also takes away some of my opportunity to mess with setting. It needed to be set there. So that took away some of my options in terms of suspending time, suspending place. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, so like the surrealism is usually like one of the first things that interviewers always ask you about. I mean, and it makes sense because it is striking. But I mean, so you've had a lot of opportunity to talk to a lot of different people about it. And I know you've talked before about, using the surreal, for example, as a way of displacing the reader so that you can kind of make people have to suspend disbelief. And then you can kind of use that as a way of sort of sneaking them into a critique of the real world. Or you've talked about, like a lot of times when you're talking about Ripe, you've talked about this sort of surreal element of having this black hole that follows Cassie around. This is like a way of giving the reader a way to sort of a place to put their own stuff that they can fill in on their own. How like for you, the black hole might be grief, but for somebody else, it might be anxiety. So like prepping for this, I not only reread both books, but I also was reading a bunch of your short fiction. Like I basically read everything that's still available.
That's so sweet. Thank you. It's very rare to get read that deeply. I think there's, I think because we're kind of in the like, I don't want to say media cycle of books, but because everyone's kind of on a deadline and there's a publicity, there's a time limit to publicity. People don't always have the time to do like a super deep dive. And so it's really lovely that you did that.
Well, I do my best, but it's interesting to hear you say that the surrealism, especially with the Book of X, is sort of a way of like, or not necessarily that it's the purpose is to distance the reader or the book from yourself, right? But that it does that. Because one of the things that I was thinking a lot about when I was thinking about sort of the use of surreal in like your whole body of work is that I was thinking a lot about poetry, because you do have a little bit of like you made an erasure poem out of some emails that you had with Noam Chomsky. And obviously, like, I know like Tommy Pico is your best friend, and even just that reading that we did, like, Tommy was reading from one of his book length poems and I read a couple of my poems. I know poetry is something that you do engage with. And what struck me in reading through your body of work is that it does often feel very poetic to me. And in particular, that the use of the surreal feels like a way of sort of literalizing metaphor, that the way that you use these things works very similar to the way that metaphor works in poetry. And I guess there can be a way that, because a lot of people find poetry to be kind of opaque. and distancing and off-putting because it is not prose and because it is not, or is often not like everyday speech. But I think that there is also a way in which the use of metaphor and the use of heightened language and the use of image that poetry does, which I find very similar to the way that you use all of these things, can also sort of provide a deeper experience than something that's perhaps a little more straightforward. So I wanted to sort of start with metaphor, maybe how you think about it, what your relationship to metaphor and to poetry is, things like that. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, of course. I think like the first experience that I truly had, I was always a reader, right? So ever since I was very young, my father was very into like having me read the newspaper, and he was just a big reader. So that kind of passed down to me. And then, but I think my first experience of literature was, I think I was in, I don't know, 9th or 8th grade honors English, because I was always in honors English, even when I was like bombing everything else. It was like the one thing I never could mess up because I just got it, you know? And, I think that's where I first saw a poem by Sylvia Plath. And it was like the teacher put it up on the overhead projector. And it was just like, I knew immediately, like I felt it in my body. And I think after that, I was just kind of hooked on what literature could do, right? Versus kind of like the mass market reading that you're probably doing up to that point. And so, yeah, I've always been just so fascinated by what can happen on the line level. And that's something that is probably what takes the most amount of time with my work, is like getting each line so good. But when you talk about metaphor, I think it can bring the reader in, but I also think, especially with the Book of X, there is a certain kind of reader who isn't going to get over the idea of a woman with her stomach in the shape of a knot, right? There is a certain type of reader who is not going to come with you to a meat quarry, because there's metaphor, but then when you add that to surrealism and take it to its natural conclusion, that's a bigger ask of the reader than saying that, your lover's skin is like snow, right? Like it's asking a little bit more because it gets so weird, but I think there's a way where it can bring the reader in, but obviously it's they're self-selecting in, they're opting in because they're willing to get over the first couple pages with me and go with me. And some people don't want to, and that's okay. Some people want like a very, simple story that isn't going to require that of them. And so I think that's kind of the difference. It is metaphors, but I take them to the very, very far extreme, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's probably true that there is going to be something about, really any work of art that's going to be opaque to some people, right?
Yeah. And in a way, the older I've gotten, the more comfortable I am with that. It's like, it's okay. And I think too, I'm the same way, right? Every book, I read the first sentence, and if I don't love the first sentence, I don't finish it, right? That's how picky I am. And so I'm doing the same thing, just in my way, in my little world,
Yeah. I'm also thinking a lot about visual art in this way, that, visual art is also something that people often can find kind of opaque. And yet, this is something that I do in my own work, although I've been a little bit shall we say, on hiatus with my visual art for the last little bit. Yeah. But the hurdle to understanding where a visual artist is coming from can be steep. But that if you get there, that it can be something, I don't know if it's necessarily more profound, but that it's just profound in a different way, Like there's some kinds of artistic experiences that you can kind of only get to by being willing to put in a little work, I guess, which I'm not necessarily saying that like reading either of your books is work, but just that there is some kind of effort that's required by the reader to sort of meet the story where it is. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it's very funny. I have a lot of visual artist friends, and this is one of my favorite things to talk to them about, because for visual artists and musicians, I get so jealous because they're just asking for like 2 or 3 minutes of time. And I'm asking for, 3 hours. And so that's a lot. It's a lot to ask of someone. But then I talk to them and they kind of disabuse me of that notion, because they end up monitoring the audience's investment in a different way. So they'll be very concerned of like how long someone stands in front of their painting, or if they pick up their phone while a song's being played. And so that always kind of fascinates me, because I've envied them for so long, but then in reality, like they're in the same boat I am. Their metric just looks a little bit different. And so that kind of gives me at least a little bit of solace, because I think no artist really gets away from it, no matter what the medium is, you know?
Yeah.
But I think, I do think I want the same feeling that you get from visual art or from a song, where you unexpectedly find yourself swept up in it and just kind of carried away. Like that's one of my favorite things about both of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that anybody who puts artistic work, creative work out in the world, rather than, you know, just making it for yourself, there is going to be some desire for people to connect with it on some level. Otherwise, why would you put it out there?
I go back and forth with that. I feel disconnected from it by the time it comes out, like even now. And I think it's probably just me disassociating out of like a desire to protect myself. But like, you know, I went to the Scribner offices once when I was in New York, and one of the editors was like, "Oh, your book," and kind of gestured to it on the table. And I was like, "Who wrote that? Who is she?" You know, because it's like, and it's also, you know, I've changed so much since I wrote it. So it's also partially that, but I think as like a mode of self-protection and a way of not getting, you know, I say this all the time. I don't know how writers get any kind of ego, because I don't know how to internalize the book after it comes out. It kind of becomes separate from me.
I think that's both really relatable and kind of really different from how I have ever reacted to people engaging with my work, but also very much the same. I don't know. I don't know. The same but different feels like the kind of thing where there ought to be something profound in there, but there probably isn't. I know that visual art is something that's, I mean, it's something that's clearly very important to you. You've done a lot of writing about visual arts, both for your own newsletter and for other publications. And in your books, there are a lot of references to visual arts, real artists, like in Ripe, you referenced Alina Shapochnikov and Bia Selmans. There might have been others that I missed, but
those were the two biggies, I think.
Yeah. And you've also talked about how, you know, like when you did an interview with Nylon a while back, and you were saying like that if the publisher had let you, you might have tried to make the book in a circle shape, and you were thinking about how to make writing more sculptural. And you even have written a little bit about, you know, making sculptural work yourself, which is not necessarily stuff that you were trying to get into a gallery, but just talking about the process of making a sculpture out of eggshells in a little glass box. I'm always really interested because, you know, in my own work, I'm always sort of contending with both words and images. And for me, the image comes in the form of photography, but, you know, it's different, but also the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this question of like how writing works, how image works, you know, each of them has something that it can do really easily and with a lot of facility, and some things that it doesn't do very well. And sometimes both the challenge as the artist and the impact on the audience can come from trying to overcome the limitations of the form, you know, to like make a photograph that speaks, for example, or perhaps to make writing that's more sculptural. And thinking about your writing, which again, I mean, to me, I mean, it's prose, but it has a poetic feel to it, and it has a clear relationship to visual art. Like, I guess I'm wondering how you think about these relationships, and then, like, you know, this sort of gap between these different forms, and is that something that can be bridged, and is it something that you want to bridge, or like maybe you don't, or what would happen if we did bridge that? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity. And often when I teach class, I have people like, I'll put up a work of art and make them write based on it as a prompt. And I love it because everyone comes back with something so vastly different and interprets it. You know what I mean? Like one person will interpret the art as terrifying and threatening, and the other will interpret it as this peaceful, kind of beautiful moment, right? And so that always fascinates me. It's one of my favorite writing prompts because it's kind of like a Rorschach test in a way, right? You're like throwing something against the wall and just kind of seeing what everybody thinks they see within it. And so that to me kind of gets at what I like about combining those two forms, is that, you know, the possibilities are really endless. Like if I write a short piece based off of visual art, and I'll give you a great example. And a lot of the visions in the Book of X were based on either visual art, or I was in Iceland at the time, so the landscape in Iceland. And so those were two places where I was using the surrealism, both of art and then also just of our real world, you know, to kind of add a layer of, I don't want to say freakiness, but kind of that, you know. So yeah, I think it's so rich. I mean, I feel the same way even about music, but just in a different way, because it's more about like what I listen to while I write, which is a whole nother thing. But I just love it as a springboard, because I want my work to do what a painting does, which is the painting exists through your interpretation of it. The painting is good or bad based on your emotional relationship to it and how much of yourself you're willing to give over to it. And I'll give you a great example. I see a Rothko and I feel nothing, right? But I could talk to you about Louise Bourgeois all day long. And it's very interesting to me. The stuff that I hate is almost just as fascinating as the stuff that I love, because what about me is like so closed off to Rothko or like Donald Judd? Like, why do I think both of those people are just not for me? Like, I don't know, you know? And so there's something curious there. So yeah, I also do think I got this feedback in grad school from one of my professors that I had started writing stories against work that I hated. Like my professor had given me a couple of stories that I couldn't stand. And so I was kind of so fucking pissed off about the stories that I started writing in response to them. And so that's also pretty generative, even if you can't stand the work.
Yeah. This thing about, you know, how different people having different responses to a piece of art. And of course people do that with writing as well.
But it feels more like guttural and primal when it's visual art somehow, because I do think like the reading wants your logical brain, right? And wants your like thoughtfulness and for you to bring in like the weight of all you understand about writing up until that point. Whereas like a painting, you walk in a room and it's like, do you connect with this or not? And then you can interrogate it from there. So it's kind of fascinating in a way, I feel like.
It is. And I think that sort of gets at the difference between how like image and language sort of work differently. But also to me, sort of like one of the things about working in a more surreal or grotesque kind of way, that as an artist working in that sort of milieu, you're going to be able to provoke something a little bit more visceral, perhaps, a more immediate, and then provide people with this opportunity. I think one of the things that I was thinking about too is there was a thing that you wrote in one of your newsletters that I thought was really interesting, where you were talking about writing being the closest thing that we can get to having a shared human experience without actually speaking, but that language is really rigid and you kind of never feel like you are able to say exactly what I mean. And to me, when I'm thinking about writing versus visual art, I think the thing that is, or one of the things about the difference there is that when we're looking at visual art, we're sort of maybe more aware of the fact that it's pointing to something without being the thing. Whereas with language, I think a lot of times we sort of forget that language is inherently something that's also a pointer and it's also symbolic. It's not the same as the thing, but our sort of logical brain is used to thinking about the way we talk about the thing being the thing. I know this is getting a little like maybe a little pretentious, but this thing about the language that you used to describe a thing isn't the thing itself, right? And yet we sort of kind of still get there.
Mm-hmm.
And something about the way that a lot of the stuff that you do in your stories and novels maybe is kind of putting the reader in more of a place to be aware of the fact that they are going to be having some kind of I'm not articulating this very well, but you kind of know where I'm going.
You mean I'm setting their expectation up that they're going to engage with this differently?
I guess what I mean is that like when I didn't go to art school or anything like that, right? So my understanding of something like a Rothko or, Louise Bourgeois or whatever is going to be sort of based on, whatever reading I can do after the fact. But primarily it's going to be like, okay, I'm going to come up to this thing and I'm going to have some response to it. And I wonder what that's about. Right.
Yeah.
And the thing itself doesn't explain itself, right? Maybe there's a caption off to the side, like a plaque or something that does, but the piece itself doesn't tell you what it's doing. It just does a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there is something like whether it's, thinking about meat quarries or a black hole that follows you around, or, even in it being more realistic, the fact that some of the things that you describe in Ripe about San Francisco that are real things in San Francisco, but that feel surreal, it pushes you to have this, like to have the response first rather than to have the understanding first. And I feel like there's something interesting in that.
I do think this is it's hard for me sometimes to talk about process in a way because I feel like it's very private. But I do think the bar for me is that I need someone to feel something when they engage with my work. And the worst thing I can think of is them reading a page and not feeling anything. And so you kind of can't let the pressure up, right? You can't walk away. You can't look away. And whether you hate the book or not, right? It's almost impossible to read it and not have at least some sort of feeling. And that's all I want, because the worst thing I can think of, and I think this is what my problem is with Rothko, the worst thing I can think of is you look at my work and you feel nothing. That's a nightmare to me, right? And so I think with depicting San Francisco, first of all, it's already rich with what is also automatically surreal, right? Because it's so tense and on edge and has no peace and there is no rest, and that kind of interested me because during that time too, I think I was really getting into like Parasite and Uncut Gems and these like stories that were just tension and escalation. And that felt like San Francisco to me. And so, when you see the narrative just get worse and worse and worse and worse, that's really, first of all, that's kind of how I felt when I lived there. Right. And so that was a true experience for me. It's so funny because I see people say all the time, like, it couldn't really be this bad. And it's like, I legally can't discuss how much of that book is true.
Yeah.
But like, let me tell you something. The fact that people think that there's anything in that book that someone wouldn't do is absolutely crazy to me. Like, I'm like, you're not living in reality because this is how people acted there. But at the same time, you have empathy for them because they're all on edge too. I say this all the time about like people are like Cassie's friends, like she should have gotten better friends. And it's like, when you're living in a city that's operating like that, no one can be there for you because they can barely get themselves through life, right? Like there's not a sustainable support system because everyone is in the exact same position as you, which is just trying to survive and just trying to like stay there, And so I think that at least for this one, the kind of, if you want to call it a painting, I mean, I do think when I write a scene, my hope is that if you made it into a painting, it would be something that you would stop in a gallery and look at. And so, the opening, right? Like you're walking home from work and suddenly there's a man setting himself on fire. Or like you're having a depressed day and you're laying on the floor of your apartment on a Sunday and there's a giant black hole over your head, right? Like all of those things, I am thinking visually at all times. And my hope is that those scenes got people for that reason. Although I don't know if everybody, when they're reading it, like zooms out and sees it that way, you know. I do think all the time, like I don't really have the talent to be a painter or anything like that, or an actual artist, but I think it comes out in my writing, like what I would make if I had that ability, maybe.
It was kind of a weird thing to think about, like what you would do if you were good at something other than what you were good at.
Well, you know, I mean, I think about it all the time. If I had invested the same amount of time in learning how to paint, or if I had gone to school for painting or visual art, you know, maybe it wouldn't be that weird. Because I mean, I think about how many hours I've spent in my life on writing, and it's batshit insane. And so, like, I really do believe, like, if you spent that amount of time on anything, you would eventually probably get good at it, you know?
I always find it to be kind of the thing where just the fact that I can do something makes it less impressive than the things that I can't do.
I mean, I think that's a function of being like hard on yourself. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard when your bar for work is high. You know, I mean, my thought with every book is that I wrote the best book that I could at the time that I wrote it. And that's why I don't get sucked into the whole, like, it's going to take me 10 years to write a book thing, because the reality is, like, as a book, it's more of a testament to a time in my life versus the one definitive thing about me forever. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've even written about this in your newsletter, this idea that sort of the work, once it's done, is sort of like a little bit of a time capsule, which, I mean, even at that, like, I think there's something kind of awful about revisiting your own old work.
Oh my God. I was actually, I think this came up in my event with Roxane Gay, that like she goes back and reads her old work. And I'm like, I would never, and I will, I promise you, I've never read Ripe in a bound form. I read the first couple pages when I'm on book tour. I'll read the first 3 pages or whatever, but I would never in a million years go reread my work ever.
I'm finding that I just now, like in my 40s, have started to be able to read stuff that I wrote in high school and not cringe, and sort of like I'm distant enough from it now that I can view it with a little more compassion, I guess. But stuff that's newer is harder.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure my therapist would say that this means something about me. Like, but I'm going to sound like a bro for a second. I had this phase in my life where I just really loved ice hockey, and I was like a huge Philadelphia Flyers fan, and I was like all involved and just amongst. And there's this kind of like saying in hockey that you can never stop to admire your own past, because that's when someone is going to knock your teeth out of your head. And I think about that sometimes when it comes to writing. Like, my job is to write the next thing. It is not to sit back and look at the other thing I wrote. And you know what I mean? And so there's a way where I just try not to look back, because I feel like I'm supposed to be on the next thing, you know?
Mm-hmm. There was something you said a few minutes ago where you were talking about the thing that readers sometimes say, like, that Cassie should have gotten better friends kind of thing. And I don't know, there's something that I feel like runs through all of your work, like, I mean, basically everything of yours that I've read, which is just that there is this way in which the characters in your books are often, especially the main character, but not just the main character, are often reaching out to each other in this way that makes it really clear, to me anyway, that they have this sort of craving or maybe even desperation for connection with other people. And yet people almost never say exactly what they mean, whether that's because they don't know how to say what they mean, or they don't even know what they mean, or they feel like they can't say what they mean. You know, like when Cassie in both books actually talks to her parents, there's this sort of disconnect. There's this inability to actually say things are actually terrible or any of these things. And oftentimes there's this sort of sense that the characters outside, you know, other than the main character, being kind of opaque to the protagonist, and vice versa. And I was thinking about this because it is such a sort of strong theme, I feel like, that recurs in your work. But also because when I was reading through your newsletter, when I was prepping for this, there was a Valentine's Day post that you made a couple years ago, and you shared this poem by Matthew Olsman, and it's a love poem. And there was this throwaway little line that you said before you shared the poem, that basically that you're a romantic at heart. And I guess I don't 100% know what the question is here, but there's something about the idea of a person being a romantic at heart, but whose fiction, so much in your fiction, there is what you're depicting is a feeling of disconnect and alienation. Mm-hmm. That, I don't know, I guess I just wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think there's like, both things can be true in the sense that you can want connection and also not always know how to get there. Mm-hmm. Right. And then also, I do think fundamentally this is the human experience, because we will sort of never understand each other. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. No matter how much we tell each other, like, I could live with someone for 10 or 15 years and still not know what happens in their head every minute.
Yeah.
You know? And so I think it's more of a grappling with that, and the idea that like you can want and crave connection, but until we create some level of like mind reading or like Elon Musk brain chips, we will always be other from each other. And the thing is, but that's kind of what unites us, right? We're always going to be separate from each other, but that's what we have in common. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite artists, Anne Carson, she talks a lot about how her work is meant to make us understand that we are alone together. And I really love that, because it's like both things are true. You can be a huge romantic and, you know, in your personal relationships, but then you also can understand that there's a real limit to how much you know another person. And what we bring with us is also something that, you know, the baggage that we carry and how we show up in our relationships, all of those things can really keep us from each other, you know?
Yeah. It feels a lot like, I don't know, there's something about, I don't know if this is more acute right now just because of late capitalism, which certainly, I mean, that's something that is very present in Ripe. I don't know if maybe this is sort of always the way it's been. I mean, I guess we had stuff like Death of a Salesman before, but I don't know, there is something that feels about contemporary life that is very much, I don't know, foregrounding these things in ways that maybe, I don't know if it's just that I'm older and so I notice it more, you know, or
well, I mean, I think there's something happening with like a lot more bad things do feel like they're happening and we have more access to them. I mean, I think one of the things that I was going for in Ripe, and I think this is why some people kind of read Cassie as having no agency, I wanted her to be placed up against a lot of systems that she had no control over, because that's really what it feels like, right? Whether it's like bodily autonomy or the economy collapsing or the climate change, right? Or the tech company that just kind of runs her over. All of these are systems of the world that she really can't change. And like one of my least favorite critiques of the book is someone was like, well, she should have just gotten roommates. And it's like, the point of this is not that she should have gotten roommates. The point of this is that life has become so untenable that asking for something as simple as renting your own little shitty apartment is now considered like a luxury and like you're being a diva. And that's crazy to me, right? Yeah. Like we're asking for the smallest things. I mean, I still work in tech and we've had like rounds of layoffs recently and it's brutal. It's brutal but there is like a guilt that you didn't get laid off. You're watching your friends lose their jobs. It's hard. It's horrible. You know? Mm-hmm. And so I think at least with Ripe, I really wanted to let myself just like look it in the face.
I think there is something that is really, you know, for example, I know that you've talked before about how there were other versions of the story where, you know, she goes and burns it all down, for example, and or where Cassie quote unquote wins, right? And that felt really false to you. And so that's why you changed it. But I think one of the things that I find, not just in terms of people engaging with the books they read or the art that they see, but just in life, that one of the hardest things for people, well, I'll say Americans anyway, to sort of grapple with is the degree to which we really don't have control over our lives, and that in real life we have a lot less agency than we like to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways in which people are really incapable of even engaging with that as a concept. I find it really, I don't know, it's interesting. So it's interesting to hear that that is also sort of something that a critique you're hearing about the book, because I think one of the things that the book does really well is, and actually there's this in the Book of X too, where it's not a question so much of whether or not Cassie has agency, because agency implies some sense of having options, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think someone did ask me if like she was complicit, and that bothered me a little too, because it's like, well, she needs to make money. So like, is this something like, would she just wake up of her own volition and do evil things? No. But she's in a tenuous position and she has to survive. And this, I mean, I have to be honest, this is how capitalism works, right? It gets you into a place where you cannot step out of it for even a minute, or you're going to lose your house. You're not going to have food. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, you're not going to have healthcare. It's very much of a piece, you know? Yeah. I mean, I will say too, I think perhaps like we don't have to go down this path in terms of a topic, but I do sometimes think, especially as a woman who has recently lost a lot of rights, there is a kind of a privilege to being able to say like that you have agency, right? Mm-hmm. That's like to me at this point, that's pretty much a delusion. Like if I walked around and said that as a woman, I had agency, I sort of don't. And to be honestly, none of us do, because we've got a militarized police force. So like, do you have agency if when you protest, you just get tear gas and you get rubber bullets shot at you? I mean, we'd have to have a real conversation about that. And people don't want to, because then that means they have to do something about it. And then that means they have to stop with the creature comforts, But I mean, I think this is of a part of America, right? Like, we don't protest the way other countries protest. We're still so comfortable because we're still, despite everything, so rich and so insulated from the very real realities of things like war and bombings, right? Because of geographically how hard it is to do anything to us. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, which is like, I know it's a little bit touchy, but I had gone to a couple countries where they were recently out of a dictatorship. And I obviously hate Donald Trump. I do not want him to be president. But when you go to a country and you see people who are 10, 5, 15 years out of a dictatorship, and you talk to them and they're talking about how their grandparents are missing thumbs or their aunt and uncle were disappeared, it's very different. And it does kind of underscore the like American luxury of like not having that happen here. Yeah. And we do. Yeah, right. I mean, hopefully never, right? But at the same time, like when we leverage this language that has a very real meaning that hasn't happened here, it's like, oh, I mean, obviously things are not great here, but when you see people who have it really, really bad, it's hard to come back here and be like complaining about us. My point of this is we're still comparatively a very wealthy country, right? We have enough money. I mean, I think I read somewhere, I think there's a book called The Anatomy of Revolution, I think I read a long time ago, and it talks about like what is required for someone to overthrow their government. And a lot of it comes down to starving, or something like if gas got too expensive for it to be worth it for us to go to work. So like gas would have to hit like $20 a gallon, right? And that's kind of crazy to me, because it's like, we're only going to riot if we can't afford to go work. You know what I mean? Like, that's like a very deep sickness to me. So like, we either have to be starving or we can't afford to go do labor, and then we're gonna riot. Like that blows my mind every time. But anyway, I think these are things that I think in America we're starting to have more conversations about, but we really haven't hit that same tipping point that you see in other countries where the protests are like all out and they refuse to go to work. Like, we're still protesting on nights and weekends, and that's I don't how effective is that? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. We're gonna have to wrap the first segment pretty soon here, but
Okay.
there was one. So this is all kind of reminding me of a thing. Do you read Brandon Taylor's newsletter?
Oh, here and there. I've been slammed recently, so I'm not up to date probably.
He wrote the last one he wrote was a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about a craft talk that he did at Columbia recently, and he was talking about something called moral world building, and some of the stuff that we've talked about here, and also just in general, when I was reading Ripe, I was thinking a lot about it. Brandon has a lot of insightful things to say about sort of the state of contemporary fiction. He wrote a while back about how nobody in contemporary fiction seems to have bodies anymore, or that they don't exist in physical spaces, which that was also something that I thought about in terms of your work. But this moral world building thing, I might not be summarizing this right. I might be sort of oversimplifying it, but he was talking about how a lot of contemporary fiction seems to exist in these worlds that don't have a moral vector, where everything is kind of morally ambiguous. And it kind of makes him ask, to what end was this written? And one of the ways that he was saying, like from a craft perspective, that sort of exemplifies this is how every character ends up having some kind of a backstory that explains why they are the way that they are, even the characters who are antagonists or who are minor or that kind of thing. And, it's not that he was arguing that people should be writing stuff that's like simple and moralistic and didactic and stuff like that, but just that the fear of being seen as didactic puts us in a place where we're not able to have characters that just do things where we're not expected to have some kind of empathy for them, where people can just be villainous, for example. And one of the things that I was sort of thinking about when I was reading this, and even just as we've been talking, you were talking about, sort of having, there are these characters in Ripe who act in shitty ways, like her friends or her immediate supervisor, where you can have this little moment of empathy. But there are also characters who are just like, like the CEO. We're not really given like a thing about, why is he the way that he is? What happened in his childhood to make him be unethical in this way, right?
Yeah.
Even her supervisor, there's a small moment at one point in the book where Cassie sort of is like, yeah, she must be fucked up about everything too. But then immediately she's just being awful again. And there's something about, let me just.
I mean, I think I sort of understand what you're getting at, and my initial thoughts are twofold. The first is that part of that is a function of first person, and I think Brandon tends to write in third person, if I'm remembering.
He does usually,
work. Yeah. And so
he wrote something in first person once, and it made me gasp because I was like,
well, I think the thing is, these characters are the kind of characters who would never, ever reveal themselves to her in a real way, right? The CEO needs to maintain power and control. Her boss needs to maintain power and control. So it's a little harder in first person to get yourself into that mess because those people would never reveal themselves ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what happens with first person is you can have surface characters who are evil because you don't have the capability to go into all their heads. And the reader isn't expecting that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of the people that she works with are, I think you use the phrase opaque, and I think that's fitting. With her parents, it's a little more complicated because they're opaque for different reasons. I mean, when I think about it, I wonder if we're all opaque for different reasons in different ways in order to like maintain our relationships and maintain our status in those relationships, right? Like parents are opaque because if you find out that they're real people and they've made huge mistakes, you won't listen to them when they tell you not to do something, right? Employers are opaque because they always know at some point they might have to fire you and they need to stay in power, right? And your friends might be opaque because they want to stay friends because it benefits them in some way. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's a way that all of us function sometimes.
Yeah. I think there's something about the way in which the characters who are not Cassie in these books can have this opacity to them is true to life, is true to the way that we experience the world, right? The thing that I found sort of fascinating about this thing that Brandon wrote was, I pulled out a little quote here and I'll just read it to you. And he was saying, "The goal of moral world building is not to create a terrain of moral ambiguity, but to establish a living world in which events and circumstances have corresponding meanings and consequences, where it matters that a character woke up on a given day and went out into the world and met with so-and-so on such and such path, that it was that day and that path and that moment and those two meeting. And that is why we care about the fates of the Dashwoods. That's why we care about Levin and his scything. That is why we care about the detective's son in the end of the affair. Because all these people live in a world that is itself alive, and we read its living breath in differences and shades of primacy and emphasis placed upon events and people and things. And allowing characters to be opaque, allowing the story to have a judgment about characters is just part of that, but rather that, like, the story for him is not just supposed to be a place where things like events happen in a sequence, but rather that events also have meaning, and that we're creating the art and we're reading the art. That what makes it satisfying on both ends is for it to mean something, that we spent some time with these characters. And I guess it's something that I think about a lot with my own work, but it's also something I think about a lot when I'm reading. And I feel like when I've been reading, particularly when I was reading Ripe, but all of your work, I feel like there is that what he talks about the world of the characters exist in having a moral vector is something that's true in these stories. That it's not just that characters do things, but that when they do things, it has some kind of significance. And maybe that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I would describe it the same way as Brandon, because I don't have the same language. I think there's like a different way of explaining it, but I will say, like, I don't like to waste people's time. And I think that everyone has every reason to just go open Twitter and not read my book. And so, like, if I'm creating a scene that doesn't mean anything, then I'm fucked. Like plainly put, if it doesn't mean anything, I'm fucked. I think the place where I give myself the most luxury is probably when I'm writing about her going to the art museum. Like, those are the kinds of areas where, or sometimes when she's alone, those are those sorts of areas where, like, maybe I'm letting myself have a scene that might stretch a little or not 100% be necessary. Like, if you asked me to cut it and I did, it wouldn't, like, brutally murder the story. But
those are the places where I feel like the story really breathes, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think also too, it's like, that's another challenge of writing in first person, right? Like, if I didn't have those moments where she's confronted with herself, it wouldn't be believable and it would be very weird. It would be very cold. So I think that's another challenge, because it's very funny, because I've never written in third person, and you said Brandon's only written in first person once. So we're coming at this from like, you know what I mean? Like, we're like complete opposites in this. So yeah, that's kind of where I come from with it. I am drawn to first person because of the deep interiority, and because it allows me to focus on, like, one person and the interactions they have that matter, versus when I think the argument that he's making is definitely applies to, if you're going to have third person with a ton of characters, what are you doing? What's going on? Right. So I think first person kind of weasels its way around that a little. Doesn't it?
Maybe. I don't know if I would use the word weasel, but okay.
But I mean, like, inherently there's some of what he's wanting, I think, is kind of inherent in first person.
I think that it can be. Brandon's fiction has a fair amount of interiority to it that he achieves through a very close third person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you've talked about what why you like to write in first person, or the sort of immediacy of it, or the way that third person sort of creates a certain distance that you're not really as interested in. I guess I'm just thinking, when we're talking about, we shifted to talking about capitalism and rebellion and, all of these things, right? That, whether or not the protagonist of your story goes off and starts a riot, right? Or burns a building down or whatever, which, she doesn't do that, but that the book exists in a way that the things that are happening to the character they're not excused, right? They're not necessarily that you're coming out and like having like a moralistic like story as essay kind of thing, right? But just that it matters that all of this stuff is shitty,
Yeah. I think for me, the reason that I moved away from her rebelling is that ultimately everybody involved, even if she took the company down, would just be replaced. It's like a Medusa. You know what I mean? It's like, so there is no real winning, right? Even if she quits the job, they're just going to hire someone who will work for less and keep going. Even if she took that whole company down, it would just be replaced by another company. So it's like, I think that's what made me go in the direction that I did, is that any action of revolution she takes would be so minor as to kind of just vanish in the sea of capitalism, almost undetected by anyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't 100% know what my question was, but why don't we take a little break and go back into the second segment?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you feel like talking about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I think I've been thinking a lot about dead writers.
How so?
Well, I've just been thinking, there's a series in Publishers Weekly where they invite writers to talk about a dead author that really influenced their work. And I was talking about Toby Ditlevson. And I think she's kind of my girl because she's like, one, she's very sad. And then two, the work is in translation. And you brought up poetry before. And I wanted to say at that time, like, the other thing that really inspires me is when I read work in translation, how crisp the lines are. And I can never tell if it's a function of the actual line itself or of like the process of translating it. Like, in the process of distilling the language into another language, do we get like a sharper sentence or not? And that always fascinates me. But I find the same like kind of poetic sensibility there whenever I'm reading something in translation. And I don't know if you feel that way. I don't know how much you read in translation, or like if you've ever felt that way about the line level.
I haven't done as much reading in translation as I would like. I've done some, but that question about like how much of this is the original text and how much of it is the translator. I mean, I do find that to be a really fascinating question. And I think it's one that you kind of can't get away from, right?
Yeah, like I did interview one translator and we talked about it, and she kind of said it was like a math, like on the sentence level, because you just go word by word and try to make the same meaning. But then it's going to sound like a humble brag. It's not. I've been lucky enough to have my work translated a couple times, and the translator is always very happy when you're alive, because otherwise they have to just do their best. But they'll come to you with like, oh, this word doesn't exist in this language, so, we need to rewrite the line together. And that always kind of blows my mind too, right? Like that, like meaning can kind of be short-circuited across these cultures and these places based on that barrier. I mean, obviously, yes, when you speak a different language, but there's something extra to it when you're doing it in the printed line. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's kind of been on my mind. And then also kind of when we get what we get in translation, because like Toby, I mean, she's had obviously like this huge resurgence. And it's kind of like, I don't know. It's just interesting to me, the timing. I always am curious, like, why now, right? But she is kind of like of a piece and of a time, and she is dealing with like, I don't know if you've read the Copenhagen trilogy at all.
I have not.
I think you would really like it. It's actually memoir, but it's memoir that is very, very often mistaken for fiction, like to the point where if you sometimes ask someone to find it for you in a bookstore, like they'll, it's hard. It's so well written that it kind of blurs that line, which is what I actually really love about it. And she's, there's war going on, and there's like, the rise of like Hitler and the Nazis. And so it's very like timely for us right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that might be part of the reason that she's kind of come back around. But yeah, I've just been thinking about her a lot because it's such an important piece. It's such an important book. And then I get this kind of like frustration almost that I'm never going to know if it reads exactly the same in her language or not.
Yeah. I'm actually completely unfamiliar. This is one of these things where, having gone to school for engineering and not for writing or art or anything like that, like I have a lot of gaps in what I know about the literary landscape.
Oh yeah, but she just came out though. She's pretty recent. She's not like, they wouldn't really teach her anywhere probably. I don't even know how I came to her. But yeah, so I don't know. I've just been thinking about her work a lot because like these sentences, I mean, the first sentence of every chapter kind of folds back in on itself. Like it'll be like, in the morning there was hope, right? And it's like hope, but in the past tense. And so you're like, already there's like this foreboding where you're like, oh God, it started out nice because the morning sounded so bright and good, but like I can already tell like we're kind of fucked. And so I just like, I don't know, I've just been thinking about her work a lot. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's one of these things about both reading in translation and also reading sort of across a distance in time, especially when the author is no longer living. I don't know, there's some way in which the gap between the author and the reader might be a little bit more foregrounded. And there's something, I mean, I don't know how you read, but for me, oftentimes when I'm reading something or taking in a piece of visual art or something like that, it's not exactly that I'm necessarily trying to commune with the artist exactly, but it's also not that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in all fairness, I did start a podcast where I get to talk to people about their writing and their visual art because I wanted to be able to have conversations with people. But I don't know. I think that there's something about when you experience a work of art that really means something to you, that strikes you in a certain way, that it's kind of hard for me, at least, to completely divorce myself from the idea that I'm having some kind of a connection with the artist also. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I think I know what you mean. There are certain things that you read that you kind of feel like they speak directly to you or were written for you,
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I don't know if I'm just like able to separate the artist from my experience with their art in some way, because I have so often found that like it can be very disappointing if because the artist can be a real piece of shit, and so I think I've kind of like gotten very weary of believing that I have a connection with them based on the work in some way. Is that crazy? Is that cynical? It might be cynical.
I mean, I think a certain amount of cynicism is sort of earned, especially in this world that we live in.
That's fair. But I don't know. Like I want to say too, I went to a pretty unknown MFA that was not at the same level. Like when you brought up Brandon, my initial response was, I did not go to a school where anyone taught me to talk about any of those things in that way. And so when you asked me about it, I'm like, oh, I must be some kind of phony because like I don't know how I would describe some of these things, you know? So just wanted to say I'm with you on that. And also I finally have gotten to the point where I'm like, you know, my opinion can matter and I can also have not gone to, you know, Columbia or whatever, right? Both things can be true.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's, I guess it's not this way for everybody, but certainly having chosen to create an interview show where I'm talking to people who are uniformly much more accomplished than I am, it does sort of highlight the shortcomings in both my education and my talent. But I think I'm to the point now where that doesn't bother me too much anymore. And sometimes there's something really lovely about allowing someone else to educate you, you know?
Yeah, but I also like, I don't know, I kind of want to tap on that a little because like success, how, you know what I mean? Like,
It's funny because, you know, you and I met at, like we said at the beginning, at this reading, where I was the only person in the group who had not published a book, and I still haven't published a book, and I'm not really likely to publish a book anytime soon. I know success is the kind of thing where it's it is a moving target, it is relative, and it is also not as satisfying as you want to believe it is. I get all of that. And I'm proud of the poems that I wrote that I read that day, which were, you know, the first poems that I'd ever had published. But, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to say any of this in the sense of needing someone to comfort me or like make my ego feel better. It's more just like, I think that having some recognition of what my, let's maybe not call them shortcomings, but limitations perhaps. I think being able to approach people with a certain amount of humility makes for both a more interesting conversation for the listeners and hopefully a more enjoyable one for the guest. But yeah, that's also, I don't know.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I guess what I was going to say is every single person that you're interviewing also didn't have a book out for a very, very long time.
Sure.
And like, you know, the one thing that I've learned at least is like, the things that I want to happen in my career don't necessarily happen on my timeline. Everything that is happening with Ripe is what I wanted when I was in my 20s, and it didn't happen. And that didn't mean it wasn't going to happen. It just didn't happen as fast as I wanted. And in a way, that's kind of for the best, because I think if I would have come out of the gate with like the big book deal and all that stuff, I think there's a level of ego that can come with that, and a way in which you don't understand what it's like to work your way up, right? And so I guess I just want to say that I don't look at you and say, oh, that's somebody that never published a book, because that, you know what I mean? That's not that. I don't think most people are thinking of it that way.
Probably not.
I appreciate your humility, and I think you will always be humble, because like the thing about writing is, the reason writers are always pissed off is because you see like the 10% of things that we get in public, and the 90% of the times that we're getting told no are over email, and you never hear about it. Right. So you know, for me, I'm always like, when I meet a writer who has any kind of ego, I'm like, where did you get that? Then I'm like, oh, you had that before. Like you came to the table with that, because this is not like an industry or experience where you know, I don't know. I feel like I'm always kept in check.
Well,
does that make sense?
Yes. And there's a lot of ways in which, you know, the world being what it is, and us living in a you know, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal society, like there's always going to be someone who wants to swat you down, right? I don't know about you, but certainly I experienced this when I start feeling good about the things that I've done, that some random person on social media can come along and tell you, you know, oh, you're not that great. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's more also like there's always this, I mean, I feel this way, and I'll be really transparent about it, because I didn't get like the fancy MFA or anything like that. I sometimes do feel like there's always this like level I'm never going to quite get to, you know? And so once you do publish the book, then it shifts to, oh, well, am I going to sell a lot of copies? And then it shifts to, am I going to get an award? And then it shifts to, am I going to get a nice review? And then, you know what I mean? So it's like, that way kind of lies madness if your self-esteem comes from that, because it's just impossible to predict what's going to happen with any given book and how it's going to enter the world and how it's going to unfold. And, you know, I think it does kind of create a beast that you have to keep feeding. And I think those are the unhappiest writers I know, are the ones who are feeding the beast.
Yeah.
And, you know, the happiest people that I know just love doing the work. And that, you know, that's the thing for me. Like, I'm about to go back on book tour for Ripe, and I know that I've put off drafting some new things because I want to just go into like my little creative hovel, and I can't fully do that because I know I have to go back and be in public again and talk about Ripe some more. And so I'm kind of looking forward to coming home from that and just going all in on the next thing.
Yeah.
You know,
mm-hmm.
And it's like that's my favorite. Like, it's a very kind of like a precious place to be, and like a little bubble that I get to live in. And, you know, it is kind of at odds with being in public and being on book tour. And so I'm kind of waiting until this part's over so I can just go back.
Yeah.
You know,
it's interesting. What you're saying is not like, I think it's actually pretty common it's been my experience, the way that people, let me put it this way, the people that I choose to talk to on this show tend to have in common a certain inquisitiveness and a certain openness. They're making the kind of work that a person who's really closed off probably couldn't make. What's interesting to me is, I don't know if you remember this, but when we did that reading, you had a question about who I was reading, because there were things that you noticed in my poems that, I don't know, struck you as certain, that made you wonder, like, who am I reading and what's kind of influencing me, kind of thing. And the thing that I said at the time, which is still true 5 years later, is that I actually still kind of can't believe I said this in front of him, but I was talking about how Tommy Pico, I had been reading a lot of his books at that time, and the thing that always really struck me was that Tommy's poetry always sounds like Tommy in a way that nobody else sounds like that. There's nobody's poetry who sounds like him. And so for me, the goal was to try and figure out how to sound more like myself. And it's interesting too, because, you know, whatever MFA program or undergrad or whatever you may have gone to, I've been neck deep in your writing for the past couple of months, like reading and rereading your novels, reading and rereading your criticism and interviews and your short stories and poetry, and it all sounds like you. You know, like, it's very recognizable the way that you write. And I guess to bring this back to the thing that you started off talking about being at the line level and reading in translation, how much of it is the original text and how much is the translator. I've got to believe that there is something about the way that you write that even in translation would be coming through as identifiably a Sarah Rose Etter story. Which, that's not a question, I recognize, but it's something that I think is true.
It's so hard because, one, I love how I'm saying this on a podcast interview. I don't like talking about myself. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I say this all the time about people who get jealous, like writers who can't be friends with other writers because they get envious. It always blows my mind because I can't write any other way than the way that I write. And I can't be jealous of someone because they're writing something that I couldn't write. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I couldn't write what you write. That would be like trying to take your face off of your face and put it on my face. It would look really fucking weird, you know? And right? Like, if I said, oh, he has a nice face, I'm going to cut it off and put it on my face. It's like, well, that's not how it works, right? Like I can't do anything but write what I write and how I write. And so I think that kind of gets to like when you talk about how it's like distinct in some way. I don't know how much of it's a choice, and I don't know how much of it I even noticed. I do know that like when I see themes later, like I get pissed off at myself. Like I didn't realize that I was dealing with open relationships in both the Book of X and Ripe, and that pisses me off. Like I wish I would have caught it because it's annoying. You know what I mean? Like there's stuff like that where I'm like, even I'm sick of myself, but it also was very representative of what was happening in San Francisco, right? Like they were doing the open relationship thing far before we got into where we are today, you know, and it was like very, very common there, especially because the cost of living was so high that like if you did break up with someone, you couldn't really move out, like because you would need like $6,000 to rent another apartment, you know.
Yeah.
If they wanted first class and security, you know, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, it's going to take me $10,000 to like truly leave this partner. So we might as well just open it up, you know? And I think you see a lot more of that in other cities now. But so, yeah, there's ways in which you can't escape yourself, even if you would like to.
It's funny to me,
but, you know,
the way that I'm trying
this...
to compliment you and you're turning it into it.
I'm telling you, I don't understand it. You should see me on a date. I don't know how to take a compliment. I don't like being complimented. I'm like, don't look at me. Do not perceive me.
I get it.
And I think that's why like writing appeals to me, right? Like I get seen, but not in front of my face. So it's like very lovely for me. Like I'm like, okay, you can see me, but not really.
Yeah.
So that gets back to the disconnect, right? It's like the separation, because I'm not with you when you're reading the book, right? There's a distance built into the whole medium. Going back to what we were talking about a second ago, there's this really great Louise Bourgeois documentary called The Spider, the Mistress, and the Tangerine. And she talks about how all of her work is based on this one thing that happened to her when she was like 9 years old. And how for the rest of her life, every piece of art she ever made was about that. And it gave me like such freedom, because it's very liberating to think like it's okay if you can't ever get over this thing and it keeps coming back up over and over in your work. As long as you're approaching it in a different and new way, I think it's fine. But I think about that all the time when I look at her work, this idea that like you have permission to be so obsessed with something or so hurt by something that you keep returning to it again and again, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've heard a thing before about, you know, every writer kind of just has one story that they just keep telling over and over again.
I could see that.
The last question I always like to ask everyone when I'm wrapping up is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you. You did just mention the Copenhagen trilogy, but I was wondering if there's something else. I've
been reading this book that I'm going to blurb that it's being reissued from the 1960s. And the author is a woman and she has manic depression. But what's fascinating about it is that she refers to it as her radiance. And whenever she goes to the mental institution and they give her her injections, she talks about how it's them taking her radiance away. And I can't stop thinking about it because I've never heard mental illness discussed that way. And it's something very beautiful that I keep turning over in my head. And so I think that's something that I've been moved by and chewing on a lot.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's like she calls it her radiance, and she says that when she gets the radiance, which is a manic episode, she understands that she's the princess of 72nd Street, you know, and they don't know that she's the princess, but she knows, you know, and so it's like, I don't know, it's so refreshing to see something that can be so torturous and painful made to kind of sparkle and like be seen as like an asset and a power. So yeah, I guess that's the one.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for taking the time. It's an honor to talk to you. I really, really appreciate it.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copies of Ripe and the Book of X, as well as a link to Sarah's website where you can find links to a bunch of her short fiction. I highly recommend checking those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that. And you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new episode, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.